Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And, it's funny when a lot of times I'll mention our guests, coming up the following week happens a lot. And it ends up being a different guest. So you never really know who you're going to have. We have the great Kevin Randle on tonight. I'm really excited about that. Always fun talking with him. He's a no-nonsense type of guy. And next week we're supposed to have Leslie Kane on and someone from the new Skinwalker History Channel series. I'm not sure. I don't have that information in front of me right now. So if you want to know who we're having as a guest for sure, well, unless something happens the day of, all you have to do is go over to podcastufo.com and you will see there right at the top right-hand side, there is an email mailing list. All you have to do is drop your email in that, and it's called the weekly newsletter. And click sign up, and then you will get a link to activate in your mailbox. So that's all you have to do if you want to find out what's going on. And also, we put our blogs in there as well. And this week's blog by Charles Lear, who writes for us every week, does a great job, is UFOs and the Predicted Death of Frank Edwards. Interesting kind of mystery situation, but an interesting case. And we are going to be talking about a lot of interesting cases tonight. I do want to say I hope everyone out there is, all my good listeners are healthy and staying safe. And we are going to be talking about UFOs and a great book, The Best of Project Blue Book. Now, Kevin, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm going to say, yes, I do have it in front of me. Kevin has published, he has written 125 books. Can you believe that? I mean, that's just amazing. And 27 of UFO books were published, as far as I know. I think I have that right. And so, Kevin, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
And you've done this. I think this is the second time you have done this. Like, Kevin, my guest it's not going to work out with my guest. Can you help me? And you've been very gracious. So I don't want you to only come on like that, but I think this is the second time you've done that for me. So
I think it is. Yes.
Yeah. And I just want to let you.
Somebody's got to rescue you.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, I've always appreciated your work, and I've said this before, your blog that you have. You really look into things, and sometimes if I'm wondering about a case, I'm not really certain about it, I'll go on your blog, and sure enough, there it is. You've written about, have you ever counted how many things you've written about on that blog?
There's over 1,000 postings.
1,000 postings. So if you want to get what I think is the real good source of what's going on, Kevin, what is the blog? It's Kevin Randle .blogspot.com, right?
When I'm doing my radio show, I always say www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com.
Hey, you got it down.
But I think if you just type my name in there, the first thing that in your search engine, the first thing that comes up is the blog.
Yeah, yeah.
And this I can't believe, the second thing that comes up is Kevin Randle's net worth. I'm on one of those celebrity pages that has a net worth, and I can tell you from my own experience, because my net worth, according to those pages, is somewhere between $100,000 and $134 million. They keep changing it daily. It's completely and totally inaccurate. I will confess that it is between 100,000 and 134 million.
Well, that's always good.
134 million.
Yeah. Although we don't really know these days right now. That could be tricky. But anyway, yeah, isn't there a celebrity named Kevin Randle? They're mixing you up with that? There's something like that. Is there a celebrity?
No. It's me, because one of the pictures up there is of me at the podium at the MUFON conference. And it's got information that relates directly to me, so it is me that's there.
Yeah. I just happened to catch just the first opening part of one of your shows that you do, and with Curt Collins. I've always liked Curt Collins, and he's going to be on the show, I think, in another couple months here. Are you hearing
Are
feedback?
you hearing feedback?
I have some
I get-
feedback coming through here. Oh, anyway, so it stopped. I heard you say right off the bat that you watched Project Blue Book on the History Channel, and you said you don't have any reason why they call it that name.
Well, the first season, they were dealing with Blue Book stuff and they were dealing with Blue Book cases.
Yeah.
But the last episode was one more episode they were at Skinwalker Ranch, which is completely and totally bogus, but I think it was to set up the series that's coming up. And then the last episode, they had a Russian airplane crash in Canada. They were on the scene to defuse an atomic bomb, and it has nothing to do with Project Blue Book. Their office, they're doing a classified project. In 1952, when this program is allegedly set, they're dealing with classified materials. It's an office where they deal with classified. Yet there's big windows in the doors. There's windows all over the place. They're not taped up. They're not closed. There's stuff all over the walls. And their secretary, their clerk typist, she's like an airman basic. She has no stripes whatsoever. I cannot believe you've got a classified project and you've got someone who has been in the Air Force probably about a year. They would have had a secretary with a little bit more rank. She would have had to have a clearance. She would have had to have a clearance, and not all enlisted personnel have clearances. So, there are all kinds of things like that that just kind of annoy me. Last year they did okay, but this year it's just gone completely off the rails.
Now, when I spoke to Alan Hynek's son, God, I'm missing his first
Paul?
name. Yeah,
Paul?
Paul said that they review basically the whole season with him, and he did have an objection, but he said he had an objection. It had something to do with his mother, or no, it had something. No, that was the first season. The second season had something to do with something that J. Allen Hynek supposedly was going to say, and he said, "No, you can't cross that line. You got to change that." And but I guess he's one of the consultants of the series.
I interviewed him on my program as well and got the same impression that he was delighted with the series, that there weren't really any big objections to it, even though a lot of it is complete and total fantasy. J. Allen Hynek flying in airplanes, and they're running around all over the country with the chief of Project Blue Book, whose name in this program is Quinn, and getting in fist fights and all kinds of nonsensical things. I just have I just cannot see J. Allen Hynek getting into a fist fight with anybody.
Yeah. Do you think that it kind of hurts the whole situation? Of people that are just starting to, think that this, look into this topic and think that what they're watching is all based on true stories, and I mean.
I would have said last year it really doesn't hurt all that much because they do deal with the cases, and then there's little vignettes at the end that gives you kind of the real information about the case.
Yeah.
When they did Kelly Hopkinsville, where the farmhouse was invaded by the alien creatures, they kind of dropped the ball on that one because if you've studied the case, you know that although the family was actually shooting at the aliens and knocking them down, they get up and run off. But when they showed it on the TV show, they had bullet holes all throughout the house. These people weren't that stupid. They weren't shooting holes in their own house, shooting out the windows, you dummies. And they had they had a lynch mob. The farmers with their torches and their pitchforks storming the 1952 sighting with Catherine May and those people. The name, I cannot believe the name actually escapes me at the moment. September of 1952, September 12th, the West Virginia case.
Yeah. Well, I think the show is, it's made for entertainment, but it's also, I think it's interesting. I haven't really watched a lot of it this year. I think I watched the first 4 or 5 episodes, but I I really do. I believe you did interview David O'Leary.
No,
Oh, you did not.
Arturo.
Okay.
I interviewed Arturo. Uh, he was the senior vice president. I had him on my show, and we talked about the program and things like that. He's since moved on to a bigger and better job. Interestingly, he did send me a picture when Robert Friend turned 100. Robert Friend had been one of the chiefs of Project Blue Book at the end of the 1950s, 1959, 1960. And he was in charge of Project Blue Book, but he was also a Tuskegee Airman. I did not know that until way too late. I would have loved to have talked to him about that aspect of his career. But the point is, Arturo had sent me a picture of him and I think Hynek's and Robert Friend, which was kind of an interesting thing. I put the picture up on my blog so people can see it. But we're doing entertainment, and I just don't understand Hollywood in that respect. Take the Custer Massacre. They always have to jazz it up with something. I'm thinking, you've got an amazing story here. You don't need to embellish it with Hollywood nonsense. The same thing with the first movie on Midway that they did in the 1970s. They had that story that Charlton Heston's son was running around with a Japanese woman who was involved in the interment. Her family had been interred when they rounded up the Japanese Americans, and they shouldn't have done it. And they got all into that nonsensical aspect of it, which is just not germane to the story of Midway. And one of the important things that they really kind of glossed over was the fact that we were reading the Japanese codes, that we had broken the codes, and the Japanese were of the mindset that a code created by the Japanese would be near perfect, and we Occidentals would be unable to crack this code. And of course, they had been able to do it. And that was how we knew that they were going to attack Midway and had our forces there to repel that assault. And that to me is a fascinating part of the story as well. But they interject this love story in there for no reason other than, I guess, to condemn the United States for rounding the Japanese Americans, I should say, up on after the attack on Pearl Harbor. You can understand the mindset. You can understand what they were thinking. It was completely wrong. And what's always glossed over is German Americans and Italian Americans were also put in internment camps, not in the numbers of the Japanese, but they also were interred, and that's never brought up either. So the real point is, you've got something that's, I think, fascinating in and of itself, and they've always got to do something to jazz it up and take it away from the real story. And when they say that it's based on real facts in today's world, they've gone completely and totally off the rails. And I don't know what, other than there was a Project Blue Book and J. Allen Hynek was a real guy, I'm not sure what they're doing.
Well, it's not really much to argue with as far as that goes, because, you're not the only one that has said almost exactly the same thing. Like, there is already so much to it. Why does it have to be embellished? I've had that exact phrase, quoted on this show before, and I understand kind of both sides of this. I understand you have to try to make something really, entertaining to, as far as the characters and what happens to, grab the people in and get them to keep coming back every week to see, what's next. But, I get both sides of it, really.
Well, I would say this. You've got movies today that have no plot, no character development. All they're doing is high-speed chases and explosions. Let's drive over there and blow something up.
Yeah.
I'm saying if you're a good writer and a good storyteller, this should be fascinating without the embellishments. I've always said that I think history should be the most fascinating course that's taught in schools because you're dealing with real people and real events that you see in the movies, and there's books, like thousands and thousands of books written about it, and yet they manage to suck the life out of history. When was the Declaration of Independence signed? Well, on July 4th, 1776. Well, not really. And some of the names weren't appended until months later. But we don't get that, and we don't get what caused this sort of thing where we're just busy learning people and dates. We're not learning anything about the persons or the people involved in that sort of thing. So I don't think you need the embellishment, but it's gotten into lazy storytelling. Well, what interests people? Well, we want to bring in the teenage boys, and they like to see stuff blow up. If you remember that one show, well, it blowed up real good.
Yeah, that was in Stripes, I think, right? Yeah. Maybe.
I was thinking of the Great White North on SCTV, but that's a whole other. But if you remember MythBusters, they were always blowing stuff up.
Oh,
and if
yeah.
they didn't get to blow up, let's add 2 tons of dynamite and see if it'll blow up now.
Oh, I see. We have Dave Altman in the chat room, and he just wrote, and he is a. Let's see, he's an event publicist for one of the people in Project Blue Book. That's his. What he does, and it says it allows regular people to get interested in the subject. It's like the new X-Files. That's kind of his take on why Project Blue Book does what it does.
I have no objection to that. What I'm saying simply is that you don't need to embellish it with a lot of Hollywood nonsense. Mm-hmm. To me, it just smacks of poor writing. I mean, I spotted a flaw in the program that I thought nobody else in the world would have spotted. I mean, we're dealing with 1952, and one of the generals, Neil McDonough, one of my favorite actors, is wearing an Air Force Commendation Medal on his ribbons. That wasn't created until 1958.
Yeah.
Ergo,
I'm terrible. I'm terrible like that myself. I look at sets, and I'm always looking at sets and say, when's this supposed to take place? 1962? Well, that didn't come out until 1969, or, the lava lamp or whatever it is.
And I haven't figured out why they've got 2 4-star generals running around in this program.
Yeah.
As sort of overseeing the whole thing. We got 2 4-star generals running around. I would maybe buy 1 brigadier general, but 2 4-star generals who are deeply involved, I don't think so. And you can tell how important Project Blue Book became. In 52, it was very important. There's no doubt about it, and things evolved after the Robertson panel in 1952, or 1953. And then you started bringing in people to lead it who were anti-alien, anti-UFO type people. And then, and it was sort of a dead-end job. Well, what are you going to do with this guy? Well, he's got a couple more years on his career. He's not going anywhere. Give him Project Blue Book. And it's kind of a dead-end career for an Air Force officer to be put in charge of Project Blue Book. It's like, you'll be in charge of the supply depot in Bakersfield, California, counting mess trays. Or forks or something. I mean, it was kind of a dead-end job, and you knew if you were, and that I always felt that way. That Hector Quintanilla, who was the last chief of Project Blue Book, I mean, he came there as a captain, and he just stayed forever, and he eventually retired as lieutenant colonel. So he got his promotions on time, but I think he was bitter, and reading his book and some of the things he said, I think he was just bitter about being stuck in that dead-end job, and he knew what they were doing to him. The guy was a trained physicist. But his name was Hector Quintanilla, and he was Mexican American, and so they just sort of pushed him to the side. And that was what they did with him, and I felt kind of bad for him because of that.
Wow, yeah. Now, in this book, and the title is "The Best of Project Blue Book." Were you did you actually review the files themselves? Because I know a lot of them are available.
I have had, since the mid-1990s, a complete set of the Project Blue Book files on microfilm.
Ah, wow.
And then, of course, I now have a complete set. Well, it's not, I don't think it's complete complete, but the vast majority of the site of the Project Blue Book's on a 1 terabyte hard drive. I can carry Project Blue Book around in my pocket, which always stuns me. But yes, I had complete access to the Project Blue Book files. And so I would compare what was on what I had digitally with what was originally in microfilm. What happened was back in 1976, when I was going to the University of Iowa, I actually was before that, I was in Air Force ROTC. And the newsletter came out and said that the Project Blue Book files are now available for scrutiny they've been declassified and they're available for scrutiny at Maxwell Air Force Base. And I went to college in what I called my Saga scholarship. Saga was a men's magazine from the 1950s and 60s. You know, it wasn't like Playboy. It just featured stories that were of interest to men. And they would always run a UFO article once a month. And then they developed the Saga UFO report, and it was all UFOs. And I would periodically call the editor, and sometimes he'd call me back, and sometimes he wouldn't. Well, I discovered that the Project Blue Book files were available. So I called the editor, and they said, well, can we take a message, as they always did? And I said, yes, tell them I can get the Project Blue Book files. And the editor didn't call me. The managing editor called instead. And he starts telling me what to look for. I said, well, I guess we got an assignment, don't we? And so a friend of mine, Bob Cornett, and I went down to Maxwell Air Force Base and pawed through the files at that time. This was before they were all redacted. And the first thing we did was go to the index, and we wrote down the names of everybody who was, the index had the date of the sighting, the witnesses, the location, and the conclusion that was drawn. So we went through the all unidentified. So we wrote down all of that with the names, so we could put the names back in. They really didn't do a good job of redacting the names. The point being is, yes, I had access to the Project Blue Book files, and I've been playing with them since the mid-1970s. And if I opened a door in my cabinets back there, I could show you the microfilm. There was 96 rolls of microfilm. And you could purchase them one at a time, and I would purchase them as I needed them, so I ended up with a complete set. So yes, I went through the Project Blue Book files. So what I did was I pulled up the project card that you would see on the first thing you would see in the file, and that is at the top of the page with that sighting on it. So you can read what the Air Force said on the project card. And then I detailed the sighting as the Air Force investigated it. But I had access to information the Air Force didn't have, which simply is meaning that, you know, if once Project Blue Book closed, they didn't update the files or do anything. And I was able to do that. I was able to talk to witnesses who could give me more information, or I could access additional information that the Air Force didn't have access to at the time. So I brought all of that into play as well. What happened afterwards? What happened to the witnesses? I talked to witnesses that were involved in some of this. For example, the Washington National sightings from 1952. That's the sightings on radar over Washington National Airport in 2 consecutive Saturday nights in July. And I was able to talk to Al Chop and Dewey Fournet, who were in the radar room on the second night. So I talked to them in the 1990s, but I asked the questions I wanted to ask and got the information. So I was able to plug that information into the book, stuff that didn't make it in the Project Blue Book files, that their memories and their reaction to what went on isn't in the Project Blue Book files, and I was able to gather that information or use that information as I gathered it some 20 years ago. So that was what the idea was. Here is some of these great stories. Here are some of the interviews I conducted with people long after the events. Here are some photographs. Levelland, Texas, for example. I knew where the various sites were that the people saw the UFO that landed in Levelland, Texas. So I was able to go to those sites. And here's a photograph of what the site looks like, at least today. So you get an idea of how desolate it really was out there and why the things were going on. But Don Burlinson, for example, a guy living in Roswell, New Mexico, by coincidence, had studied the Levelland case. He was able to interview the daughter and the widow of the sheriff from Levelland. And he learned that the sheriff had been told not to talk about the sighting, and he wouldn't do it. But it appears that the sheriff got a lot closer to the UFO when he went out looking for it than had been in the Project Blue Book files. It suggests he was 900 yards away or something like that. Talking to them, the family said, yeah, he got a lot closer. And I was able to find a newspaper article, by coincidence, from the time frame that wasn't in the Project Blue Book files that said, where he is quoted as saying he got within 200 yards of it. He was much, much closer. And so that confirmed what the family said. So we've got a contemporary quote from a newspaper that confirms what the family was saying, 50 years later or 45 years later or whatever it was when Don talked to them. But I was able to bring all of that information to play in the book as well. So it's not just what the Air Force had to say. It's additional information that I was able to gather long after Project Blue Book closed and appended to that. And he says, well, here's where we go today. And here's what we know about it today.
I like that. That approach is really, really great. We're a little past our break. We got to go into break. So hang in, everyone. We'll be right back right after these messages. Right. Welcome back to the show. My guest tonight is Kevin Randle. And we were talking about the Levelland, Texas case just before we went on break. However, Kevin, I wanted to tell you, guess who's in the chat room? We have Shane Ryan in the chat room. He just said hi. He remembers having dinner with you in Toronto. Shane Ryan from Australia. Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah, the Westall case. We had Shane on, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago. That was back when they were having the fires down there. But no, it's good to see him. He's putting up all kinds of information on the chat room for everyone, which is great. So, so let's getting back into your research. I wanted to find out. You said that you saw these files unredacted, and a lot of times you see, I don't know, not these in particular, but you see things that are really, really redacted beyond being able to recognize what they're talking about. It has nothing to do with just private information or classified information. I guess what I'm getting at, did you see anything really interesting on the unredacted files that are redacted in further files?
The only thing that redacted out of the Project Blue Book files were the names and the personal information.
That's it. Okay.
So you would look at a case and you couldn't follow up on it because the names had been redacted, but they did a crappy job. And the one that really cracked me up was they had an interview with Kenneth Arnold, who's the guy that started this whole thing with his sighting in Mount Rainier.
Yeah.
There was a telephone interview with him. And they'd even gone to the trouble of crossing out his initials, KAA. But across the front, in grease pencil letters that had to be a half an inch high, it said Arnold case. Kind of gave the whole thing away there, pal. And then sometimes there would be newspaper articles appended to the end of the file. They didn't redact those. So you could put the names back in because they were not taken out. And things like that. And if you read most of the cases you read, you could find the name if you read the case material carefully enough. The names were in there because they would miss somebody's name and you could figure out who it was. The only thing that I had trouble with is the Lubbock Lights. The first sighting took place in Albuquerque before it got down to Lubbock, or they think it's kind of together. The sightings kind of match. And I was able to get the name of the husband, both his first and last name, but most of the newspapers said Mrs. and didn't give her first name. And it took me about 20 minutes to find her real first name. It wasn't in the files. I had to go online to do it. And that's the other thing about the internet. You can usually find what you want. I was able to find her first name so I could plug it into the story. But that was what they had redacted from that. And the other thing is you heard, I think repeatedly, there were no classified files in Project Blue Book or things like that. And they would, especially in the 60s, they were saying we have no classified information. Well, you go through the files and you could see the classification marks on it. Sometimes they're blacked out in heavy black magic marker so you can't see them. But if it's a really long black smudge, well, that was confidential. And if it's a shorter smudge, it meant secret. But sometimes they just crossed it out with a single stroke of a pen or something like that so you could see that they were so there were classified files there, of course. I think Rob Mercer from Ohio blundered into the Project Blue Book files. He said that, and I interviewed him on my program. I think you may have interviewed him as well. That he would look at Craigslist periodically for
Yes.
UFO related material.
Yep.
And somebody had a box of material up there that had Project Blue Book stuff in it. So he bought the box. And as he was going through it, he realized it really was Project Blue Book material. And through some very nice detective work, managed to find the guy who had originally had the box of material. And there was more of it. A guy named Carmen Morano, who was technically the last officer in charge of Project Blue Book, because everybody else was gone and he was tearing down the office, and he didn't think the stuff would be destroyed and he was going to go through it later, but he just kept the boxes. And when he moved, he inadvertently left a box behind, and that was how Rob Mercer got his hands on it, because somebody bought it at a garage sale, and he found Morano, and he sent more stuff to him. He said, well, you can have it all if you want. And in that was a complete set index of Project Blue Book without the names redacted. The index is quite I've got the index printed out from the microfilm, and it's in 2 loose leaf notebooks. So it's a huge index. So he's got all that information, but he's got everybody's name in that. And there's and a lot of the other material isn't redacted. So when I was doing when I was doing my book on Socorro, Encounter in the Desert, the Lonnie Zamora stuff, he sent me the entire file that he had, that included not only the stuff that was in the official file, but the unofficial file, which they used to brief other people. Ben Moss and Tony Angiola think it's the classified file, but from what Carmen Morano told me and from what Rob Mercer told me, what they had done was the cases that everybody was interested in, they'd created other files so they could get to them easily and hand them to the reporters or whoever wanted to look at them. So it's not an secret unofficial file, it's just an unofficial file. But he sent me all of that stuff. So I had that, I could plug that in. And what kind of triggered that, and I'm off on the Encounters in the Desert now, which is about the Socorro landing. What triggered that is I had Ben and Tony on my program, and they said a couple of times that 3 people had called into the police station before Zamora went out, before Zamora got to the landing site, to tell them about this thing in the sky. And I said, is that in the police log? Did you look at the police log? And I never got a satisfactory answer from them on that. So I was looking the stuff up myself, and going through the file, I found a report written by Richard Holder, who was an Army officer who was there the night it happened, and he was working with the FBI agent talking to Zamora and that stuff. And he said in his report right there, the 3 people who called into the police station with reports of this thing flying over. So here it's documented from April 24th, 1964. So you've got the documentation. What stunned me was nobody followed up on that. When you got the UFO investigators down there, you got Hynek down there, you got all those people down there, and the story's out there, and nobody tries to find who these witnesses are. They didn't leave their names, or the police dispatcher didn't take their names, and because he just was unimpressed with their stories, but they knew the flight path. It wouldn't have been hard to find them given the size of Socorro at that time, but nobody bothered to do that, which is just one of the great missed opportunities, because you would move the Socorro case from being a single witness, Lonnie Zamora, to multiple witnesses at different locations as it flew over. We have some documentation to suggest they were out there, and it would have been really nice to talk to them and get their impressions of what they had seen. But here we are in 2020, not able to leave our houses, and we just are unable to track the people down now.
Wow. I do want to talk about some of the cases, because that's, we do get a lot of new listeners, and a lot of times I forget. And speaking of new listeners, I just found out this is the 2nd show in a row that my sister Heidi is watching. So, hi Heidi. I'm glad she's watching. She's a wonderful artist, by the way, and she's starting to make some art. We're going to actually put that up on the website coming up soon, hopefully. But she's very talented. Anyway, getting to cases, I saw, you talk a little bit about Project Sign and Project Grudge, if I have that right. The two, what am I trying to?
Predecessors.
Thank you. Before, yeah. That now, why did each of those? And I want to talk about ghost rockets and all that. I want to talk about some of these really interesting things. But did they both close? How did this? What made them close and go into like the next process of Grudge and then?
They close.
Yeah, and
What happened was when Project Sign was created, that was a classified name. The public name was Project Saucer. So as they're moving along, somehow the name got compromised. They wrote a final report. They said, Sign is done. We're done. Here's our final report. All they did was change the name and kept going. Change it to Project Grudge. Same thing again. They changed the name from Grudge to Blue Book. They wrote a final report and said, we're done with Project Grudge. It's all done. But it became Project Blue Book. So it was a way of kind of protecting the classified names until they got out. And then it was a way of suggesting to the public there was nothing important here because we stopped investigating. But they didn't stop investigating. And the same thing when they ended Project Blue Book in 1969. They said, well, we're done. We're not doing it anymore. But then there was Project Moondust, which had already been created and was used as a way of continuing the investigations. And Moondust's name was compromised. Moondust was compromised in the mid-1980s. Robert Todd got a bunch of FOIA documents from the State Department, and in there was stuff talking about Moondust. And so he started looking into Moondust and realized it had a UFO component. If we had been really careful in our study of Project Blue Book, we would have found cases in there labeled Moondust. They're really crappy cases. They, I think one or two of them sound like meteors, but you go through and you read the project card and it says right on the project card, Project Moondust, or it just says Moondust. And one of the books I did, I actually had I showed the card, one of the cards that had that term on it, Moondust. So clearly there was a UFO component, and clearly they were communicating with, the Moondust people were communicating with Blue Book, but General Bolander said in 1969 that the really hot cases, really cases that affected national security didn't go to Blue Book. They went elsewhere. So now we have a general officer telling us that not everything is communicated to Blue Book, even though regulations required it. And we can see that there were other investigations going on at that time. So we know that the Blue Book became little more than a public relations outfit. But they got some really good cases while they were doing the investigation. As I said, the Zamora case in 1964, which I also cover in the Best of Project Blue Book. It's a condensed version of what appears in Encounter in the Desert. So if you're interested in that case alone, Encounter in the Desert is the book to look at. But if you're interested in just the general look at Project Blue Book and some of the best cases in it, then the Best of Project Blue Book is what you want to do. And one of the things I wanted to do, and you and I mentioned earlier the Condon Committee. They did a investigation of a sighting in 1954. They reviewed it, and they didn't solve it. They didn't come up with a solution. They said it was a natural phenomenon so rare it had never been seen before or since. I'm thinking, even if it's not leading you to an alien spacecraft, a new natural phenomenon would have been of scientific value to understand. But they just blew it off. So what I did in the Best of Project Blue Book, I looked for additional information on that case from 1954 and was able to find it. And one of the things that came up in that was the pilots of the aircraft that made the sighting near Greenland were interrogated by men from, it may have been the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain, or it may have been Air Force OSI guys talking about it. But there's a newspaper article where one of the other crew member had run into the pilots and asked him about the interrogation. He said, well, we can't talk about that. So I was able to add additional detail to this cases that appeared in the Condon report and give you some insight as to where it is. And the other thing I did in the book, and I borrowed this from Jerry Clark, in his massive UFO encyclopedia, at the end of each segment, he would list the sources. And so at the end of each segment of the book, I listed the sources used for that specific entry. So you could go to those sources and kind of follow the trail that I had followed to get to where I got there, and see if you may come to the same conclusions that I did based on the research that you can kind of do yourself.
Wow. Now, I just wanted to talk about some of the cases because that's always what's really fascinating to, the listeners out there. And one of them, he's looking through his book for those listening to the audio part of it. Anyway, you talk about the ghost rockets, which I think is such a fascinating thing, 1946. Now you really are looking, oh, I did? I only got to skim the first part of the book, but you were talking about the different phases of Project Sign and Project Grudge and all that. But the ghost rockets, I want to just get back to that because I think it is so fascinating. I've talked to Klaus Fahn about that. He's done a lot of research, and those things landed in lakes. And I know you mentioned that there was a lot of speculation that these were Russian, and they never really figured out exactly what they were. But interesting.
Well, I try to set up the whole thing to make people understand that the UFO phenomena didn't begin on June 24th, 1947, when Kenneth Arnold made his report.
Yeah.
It began actually during the Second World War with the Foo Fighters.
Yes.
And what is interesting is one of the guys involved in the investigation of the Foo Fighters was Colonel Howard McCoy. He was an American Army Air Forces officer at the time. And he was involved in it. But when the war ended, nobody cared anymore. I mean, clearly the Foo Fighters weren't German or Japanese inventions. They weren't, they weren't the enemy. And with the war over, there was no real imperative to discover what they were. So it just kind of faded away. Then in 1946, you had the ghost rockets being seen in Scandinavia over the summer. One of the people involved in that was a guy named Howard McCoy. Yeah, it's the same guy. And what you see is at the end of 1946, and McCoy is in communication with the people in Sweden, where a majority of the investigation took place. He is called in from actually their Christmas party in December of 1946 and told to set up an unofficial investigation into these aerial phenomenon. So once you end up with Kenneth Arnold, Howard McCoy has already got an investigation in place. And so it morphed into the official investigation of this. And so Howard McCoy was involved in it from the very beginning. But the thing is, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the theory had been the Soviets were doing it to intimidate the Swedes for some reason. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, and a lot of their classified documentation was available for worldwide UFO researchers, nobody found anything to suggest that the ghost rockets were being fired by the Soviets. So it's still a mystery. We don't know where they originated and what they were going to. There's a couple of pictures. I think one of them shows a meteor, but it's a picture of the guy out on the lake with his equipment, and there's a streak in the sky and that sort of thing. So there's some interesting stuff going on there. So it's a fascinating aspect of the UFO phenomenon. But to understand where we are, how we got to where we are, you have to begin with the Foo Fighters of World War II and move forward. So that was why in the beginning of the book, I do that short history of how we got to the point where we began an official UFO investigation.
I see. Yeah. Well, that all works for me. Let's see. In 5 minutes, we got to go to another break. But so I wanted to get into, for the person new that is just starting to listen, like my sister, as I just mentioned. By the way, people in the chat room are trying to get her to say tell them embarrassing stories about my childhood. She's not going to do that. But let's talk about some of these. Like, for instance, you have the Rhodes photograph on July 7th, 1947. That was, again, before Project Blue Book. But is that something you want to talk about?
It's part of Project Blue Book. Although the Project Blue, before Sign even, sign began in January of 1948. That's what I was trying to remember here. But a lot after Arnold, and they began the unofficial investigation. There are sightings that precede even Arnold in the Project Blue Book files, but the problem with those, they were reported after Arnold, so you begin to wonder if that was something of contamination. The Rhodes photograph was taken in Phoenix in July of 1947. Turns out Rhodes was a genius, really smart guy, held a number of patents, had worked for the Navy during the beginning of the Second World War. They were going to hire him to do some research or hire him on, I think, the University of Arizona, but he had a very abrasive personality, and they decided not to work with him. But he built some equipment for them, designed equipment for them and sort of that sort of thing. So he's a very bright guy. He took these two photographs on July 7th over Phoenix. Not long after he took those photographs, there was a sighting event that took place in Washington State. And Kenneth Arnold was involved in investigating that for Ray Palmer, who ran Science Fiction magazine. So Arnold was down there, and he had worked with two officers from the 4th Air Force, intelligence officers. They came up to help Arnold with the investigation and pick up some physical evidence that turned out to be useless. And unfortunately, the two officers were killed going back to their home base when their airplane crashed. But the important point here is Arnold asked about other sightings, and he was told that about the Rhodes photograph, and that was something that really disturbed the military because the photograph matched the description that Arnold had told to the military. If you look at the Project Blue Book file with the Arnold sighting in it, there's a drawing that he made, and it's kind of a heel-shaped object. The crescent-shaped object that it morphed into later on is kind of stylized, but the original drawing is a heel-shaped object. And what Rhodes photographed is a heel-shaped object. And so the military officers were telling Arnold that, this kind of corroborated his sighting. So that becomes the important point of the Rhodes photograph. But the military, after the initial investigation, worked very hard to discredit Rhodes. They said, well, he's an unemployed guy. He's got this laboratory in his backyard that he calls a panoramic laboratory, and he's the director of research or something like that. And he just plays piano at a bar, and he's living off his wife's income and that sort of thing. And just really can't trust him. Kind of smeared his whole reputation because I don't think they could really find anything else to attack. But when you get into it and you start talking about the guy and talking to his friends, what happened was I got a call from a fellow who told me about some of the Rhodes stuff, and so I started looking at it and discovered one of his friends was Arden Minden, something like that, who was at the University of Arizona. So just on a lark, we're talking about 1947. I'm looking at this stuff in 2010, 2011. Just on a lark, I checked the University of Arizona website and found the guy. He's still alive. I emailed him. He emailed me back. So he was able to tell me some of the stuff about Rhodes that the Air Force didn't put in their file. So I was able to append that to the story as it appears in the book. So you learn about what he said about the genius of William Rhodes and how some of this stuff came about simply because Rhodes, I think the military was bothered by his photographs because they were too close to what Arnold described, and they worked very hard to smear him, especially after 1952. They worked very hard to smear the guy's reputation, which I think is very unfortunate.
Wow. Well, we are right at the break, Kevin. So we will be back right after these messages. Hang in. Welcome back to the show. My name is Martin Willis, and my guest is Kevin Randle. Always great having him on the show. It's always a lot of fun. And we are going to be taking calls in about 25 minutes from now. So that number is there. If you want to write it down, it's up on the screen on YouTube. You can write it down if you'd like. And again, that's in about 20 minutes or so. We'll be back with that number for you all. And so, Kevin, as far as some of the really interesting cases when you were looking through this, I guess what I'm going to ask you is, was there any case that you really learned something, as you looked into it, that you were unaware of that is of note?
Well, I talked a little bit about some of the stuff with the Rhodes photograph, for example.
Yeah.
And looking at the Michigan sightings from 1966, the Great Swamp Gas fiasco.
Oh, yeah.
And looking at that, it was interesting to see that the explanation of swamp gas really doesn't fit, because some of the witnesses got way too close, and the swamp gas is kind of a very nebulous type fire that has a very short life. It bursts up there and fades out very quickly. And they were looking at something much more substantial. But the way the news media and the military kind of manipulated the data, manipulated the information, and how they tried to provide a rational, as opposed to an extraterrestrial, explanation for what was going on there, and how they were treating some of the witnesses. Now, that was the one thing that throughout the cases, you would see the military and the civilians being less than cordial to some of the witnesses, trying to tell them what they had seen as opposed to what did you see type thing. Well, this is really what you saw. And they would say, well, no, I didn't see that. So you go through the cases like that, and you see, I guess a really important thing is you see is the case as it's kind of been covered in the media, or what you've heard about just briefly isn't really quite the truth. There's a lot more to the case. A prime example is the Levelland case, which I mentioned earlier. You see that the Air Force saying, well, there are only 3 witnesses that saw the object. And the Air Force gets into a big fight with Don Kehoe of NICAP about the number of witnesses. And Kehoe said, well, there were 9. There were 9 witnesses. Looking at the Air Force file, I found 13 witnesses at 13 separate locations. That's in the Air Force file. And yet the Air Force is saying there were only 3 witnesses. And so you look at that sort of thing, and you can see where the military is manipulating the data. Kehoe is inflating the numbers, but not enough, because we found out there were more than he said. So the big fight was over the number of witnesses as opposed to what did they see and what were their events. I mean, you've got the object close to the ground. You've got guys within, just a few dozen feet of the thing. It stalls their car engines. It causes the lights to fade. It causes the radios to fade, to fill with static. And then when the object leaves, the lights come back on, the radio static goes away, and their cars will start. And the one thing that I discovered in looking at the Levelland cases, I noticed in one of the cases, the guy said I was able to start my car. And one of the things that we've heard about UFO sightings, when they stall the car engine, the car starts again. And it's like it's spontaneous. The Condon Committee said, well, we can think of no physical reason for the car to start spontaneously. If you suppress the engine, especially using a magnetic field, it should not restart. You've interrupted the flow of electricity, so it may cause the lights to dim, but you're not going to get the car to start spontaneously. And looking at the case files, I discovered that a number of people didn't say the car started spontaneously. They said, I was able to start my car, or the car would start. So I went back through all the electromagnetic cases about cars that Mark Rodiger had put together. He had a book that he put together on the electromagnetic effects and given you all the cases. And what I discovered is often the person said that the car started again, or I was able to start the car. It didn't say it started spontaneously, except in a very few cases. And so the Condon Committee rejected it because of this idea that it could think of no physical reason for the car to start spontaneously, and it turns out that's a misnomer. They don't start spontaneously. That was one of the things I learned by going through the Levelland case. It's kind of what sparked that area of research.
Wow. I want to just tell this quick story. I have told it, 3 or 4 times on this show over the last several years, but it's really fascinating. It's along those lines. And that is And I actually visited where this happened in Russia. This guy was driving. This guy that I talked to, is my friend's father. He told the story. He's not into UFOs. Didn't even know what it was. But they were driving through a pass, a very busy pass in Russia. I mean, like I said, I've ridden through it, and all the cars stalled. All the cars coming both ways stalled, and they pulled over to the side of the road. And his stalled, of course, and he got out, lifted the hood, and everyone else was lifting the hood. And all of a sudden, without any sound at all, this big cigar-shaped thing came right through the pass, right over them, with portholes. He saw portholes in it. And then it floated. He said it was just like moved through, like it floated through. And then everyone kind of looked at each other, and no one talked about it. Someone jumped back in their car after it went through, and it started, and everyone's car started back up. I mean, isn't that bizarre? That's just another one of those. I love actually hearing stories from someone that is, here's a Russian guy telling the story. It's being translated to me, and pretty cool.
Well, this sounds like the Stokes story from New Mexico back in 1957 after the Levelland sightings, just a couple of days later, and they're driving down toward Oro Grande. And there's a pass in the Oregon Mountains. It's not a big high pass or anything like that, but that's what happened to him. He drives up on there, and there's a bunch of cars pulled to the side of the road, and they've all stopped, and his car stalls out. So he drifts over to the side of the road, gets out of the car, he's looking up at the thing, gets a sunburn, like a sunburn from this. And he was treated in the hospital. It was a very light sunburn, and it faded quickly. But I think Carl Lorenzen and Jim Lorenzen from the Aero Phenomena Research Organization, they got there in time because they lived in Alamogordo, and of course, the Holloman Air Force Base in that area where this took place. So they got there in time to see the sunburn on the guy. By the time the Air Force investigators got there, the suntan had faded. I was able to talk to one of the guys at White Sands Missile Range, which is co-located with Holloman. You have to keep thinking, people don't know all these details, that Holloman is right there by White Sands, and White Sands goes all the way up in New Mexico to nearly Socorro and all of this sort of thing. But I talked to one of the guys, one of the MPs who was on duty the night of the Levelland sightings, November 2nd, morning of November 3rd, 1957. After the thing had left Levelland, they get involved in the UFO sighting. And there were 4 MPs involved in it. And that's what really killed me about this. So the Air Force comes to investigate, and they're making fun of they're just a bunch of kids out there, the MPs, and they were 21, 22 years old. And I'm thinking, really? You're going to do that now? You play that silly game? I was an Army helicopter pilot in Vietnam, an aircraft commander at 19. And so you're making fun of these guys who are much more mature than I was, who were guarding this thing. So, well, they were just a bunch of excitable kids. And I'm thinking, no, I ain't going to buy that fella. That was the other thing I kind of learned, that, as well as you look at that and you can see how the Air Force kind of manipulated the data, or the investigators would manipulate the data to make it not as, make the witnesses seem not as credible as they were.
Wow. Yeah. That doesn't surprise me. Ken, now I've got a little bit of an inside scoop here that I forgot to even ask you if it was okay if I talked about, and you can tell me yes or no. And there's a Roswell series. I think you were actually interviewed. That's coming up? Can you talk at all about that?
No, I'm just kidding.
You crack me up.
It's part of a larger series where some famous guy is investigating a lot of UFO stuff, or paranormal stuff, or cryptozoology stuff. And part of the series takes place in Roswell, and they devote 6 hours of this series. All the others are like an hour or 2 hours. They devote 6 hours to the Roswell case. And so we went back down and looked at the Ramey memo at the special collections at the University of Texas at Arlington, and tried to decipher that a little bit better. And they've talked to a lot of the people who had the Marcells involved and that sort of thing. So it's going to be a very interesting thing. And there's some very interesting stuff that I can't talk about yet till the series airs. And I'm sitting here thinking, I got to do a blog posting because this is really great stuff. And I can't do it because it wouldn't. I mean, it was their discovery, so they get to
Ooh.
break the story at the beginning. But once it airs, I'm going to have the producer of the show on my show when we get to the point where the series will air. They think it'll air in June, but they weren't sure exactly what the scheduling was. It's going to be on the History Channel, I believe. Yeah, on the History Channel.
Wow.
So
I want to
yeah,
keep on the loop on that so I can let my listeners know. And so if before that goes up, I mean, anything new is always interesting when it comes to a case like that.
I think we looked again at the Ramey memo, and those who I was with Josh Gates down there 2 or 3 years ago, doing the same sort of thing. And so, but you get to see, you've heard about the Ramey memo and the special collections, and you get to see that stuff now, and you get to see where all the negatives they have in cold storage. They have a vault, which is climate controlled. I think it's like 40 degrees, because they discovered that the negatives that they had were beginning to deteriorate. And so they built this $4 million vault to store this stuff. And they had literally tens of thousands of photographs that came from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which is the big newspaper in Fort Worth. So they had all those photographs, and everybody focuses on this one little deal of the Ramey memo, but they've got photographs going back into the 19th century, and some really fascinating stuff there that goes just beyond Roswell. But the case and the segment I was in, well, I did an interview, and we talked about other aspects of the Roswell case as well. So it's a long thing. I think they talked to Don Schmidt and Tom Carey, and I don't know who all they talked to the Marcells, and they were out at the museum, and they were out at the site where where Bill Brazel identified the debris field for Don and me. And I say it that way because people have said, well, you guys didn't really know where the debris field was. And I'm thinking, Bill Brazel took me out there. I'm pretty sure I got to the right place. The guy had seen it. He'd been out there. I'm pretty sure we're on the right section of New Mexico desert. So
yeah. Wow. One of the things I saw that you had in is the chapter in the book is the Heflin photographs. I think there were 3 of them. Now, let me just ask you this, and for the YouTube person on YouTube, I just put a picture up there of it. I have been told by someone that was a hoax. Do you know anything about that?
Well, of course.
Well,
you get to any good photograph, and the skeptical community, when they run out of explanations, it's a hoax.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the hoax explanation is appended to it based on some really shaky stuff that I think the Rhodes photographs are a hoax because they didn't like his panoramic research laboratory in his backyard and calling himself the director or the chief engineer or something. And they didn't like the fact that he didn't have a real job like other people do. He was a musician. And I'm thinking he's playing piano in a bar. Playing piano is a really tough thing to do. Mm-hmm. And yet he holds all these old patents, which he was making money on and that sort of thing. But they smeared him because he had he claimed to have a PhD from Columbia. And he had a little tiny wallet-side card that had that on there. And I think that the way that all came about, you're going to have to excuse me for a moment, mm-hmm. is that when he went into the Navy, or was working with the Navy, as a civilian working for the Navy, they realized in their research section they didn't have a lot of guys with PhDs or master's degrees and that sort of thing. And what they did was they created a program of giving them equivalency degrees. And you took this complex test, and if you scored well enough, well, then you had the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. Score higher, you got a master's degree, and if you scored at the top, you got the equivalency of a PhD. And of course, Rhodes scored at the top. I don't know. He had that little card. Columbia doesn't seem to know anything about it, but he had that card. And he talked about the equivalency in a couple of times. So, they decided because of that, he claimed to have a PhD. He was hoaxing it. With Heflin, it was kind of the same thing, because he talked about 2 guys from NORAD, I think it was, coming down to ask for the photographs, the original photographs, and he gave them to them. So the original photographs disappeared for a long period of time. And the Air Force was saying, well, NORAD wouldn't have been involved in the investigation. Ergo, he's made this story up and it's a hoax. Then, it was, I think, Ground Saucer Watch and Hayden Hughes, I believe, did a computer analysis of the photographs, or one of the photographs, and he found a line on it. And he suggested this line in the computer enhancement suggests it was something suspended above the truck. It was reinvestigated later, and I cover all of this in detail in the book if you really, I mean, if people really want to get the details rather than me just kind of spewing it here. But they talk about getting the original photographs back. He was told.
Yeah, the Druffels, right? Was it?
Yeah, Ann Druffel. Yes,
Ann Druffel.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Heflin was told to go out and look at his mailbox. He went out and there was nothing there. Got a call from the guy an hour later, and he says, go look at your mailbox. And there were the original photographs. So Druffel and her team were able to re-examine the photographs, and they could find no evidence of the string and they said that Hughes and the Ground Saucer Watch guys were working from a third or fourth generation print, and that it had been creased and folded and that sort of thing. And the line was probably a artifact from the way the print had been handled, and they could find no evidence of it. So I think we're back to the idea that Heflin may have photographed something really unusual. There was other evidence also that other guys working in his department with the highway services, they had radio communications, and they were having radio communications when this object was overhead, radio communications problems when the object was overhead. So there's additional information, and I think, you move beyond the idea that this is a hoax that Heflin dreamed up himself. That's always the fallback position. If we cannot explain it, well, then it's obviously a hoax.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who told me that on this show. Alice Druffel, I spoke.
Anne.
Is it? I know, but I talked to the daughter, Alice.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and Alice told me that they still have those. They have the 3 pictures in their safe, in their house, right now. So they still have those available. These are, to explain it, why don't we just explain what happened there? It was Polaroids, right? And it was a salesman or something?
Yes. No, he was worked for the highway department.
Oh, okay, right.
Driving down the road and saw this strange object through the windows of his truck, and he managed to take 3 Polaroid photographs of the object as it flew over. And another reason they thought it was a hoax is later he showed them a 4th photograph, which was kind of a smoke ring type thing, and they were all concerned that he didn't show that photograph up front for some reason. I'm not sure why, but it's an object that hovered over the area for a period of time. He took 3 very clear photographs of it. There was all sorts of analysis done, and there again, in the UFO field, pick the analysis you like the best and run with it, because there's going to be an analysis that falls into your own belief structure. If you believe there's no alien visitation, there can't be any UFOs, then clearly it's a hoax, and there's photo analysis that'll prove that to you. And if you accept alien visitations and you believe there's UFOs or flying saucers, then this photograph tends to support that belief. So you can find the analysis that will support that as well.
Do you know if he was interviewed, and intensely interviewed about this whole situation?
He was interviewed a number of times, both by the military and private UFO researchers. I think Robert Wood talked to him some years after the event as well. So he was interviewed by a lot of people. It didn't cause him any aggravation at work, I don't think. I know police officers who were involved in UFO chases and UFO sightings often found themselves ridiculed and harassed out of their jobs.
Yep.
Eventually, but I don't think that happened. I think he went on, retired from his job there. But this was in near the El Toro Marine Base in Southern California.
I see. Wow. Did anyone ever try to say it was a military, secret military project or anything like that? Are you aware of?
Nothing like that's not. Yeah, had it been a secret military project back when he took the photographs in the 1960s, you would think that we would already know what it is. We'd say, well, here's what it really was.
Yeah.
And that's never happened with these particular sets of photographs.
Yeah.
So and that's the other thing. When you look at the older cases, and they say, well, it was a military secret. Yeah. What sort of technology was available 50 years ago that isn't now obsolete, that we don't know about? Gee whiz, we know about the B-2 bomber and the F-117, which were highly classified projects in the late 80s, early 90s, and now we've got photographs of them, and we know exactly what they look like. So, I can't think of a project that would still be classified at this late date that wouldn't be obsolete now based on the advancement of our technology, because we're talking about 1960s. Right. And a Polaroid camera, which for those of you who do not know, Polaroid camera was the deal. You took the picture and it slid out of the camera and it developed in 60 seconds. You didn't have to go to a Photoshop to get it, which is, of course, digital cameras are much better now. A much better way of doing it. Not to saying a Polaroid was digital. It actually had film and negatives and all of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So I want to switch to a different case. It's actually close to home for me. I've lived in the area quite a while, and that's Chapter 13. You talk about the Exeter, New Hampshire sighting. And I'm interested to know what Project Blue Book had to say about that.
Well, it's in the book. You should read the book, darn it. I sent you a copy.
I know. I've got the book. Yeah, well, I will. I just didn't get a chance.
And I looked at what the Air Force had to say about it and where all of that went. And I think what you look at, you see that it's not just a single witness case. The Air Force glommed onto the ionization of the atmosphere explanation, which Philip Klass invented because of the Exeter sighting, saying that the electrical discharges from these high tension lines would ionize the air, and that creates these big glowing balls of gas. And anybody who's lived around high tension lines know that's really true. By the way, that was sarcasm. But the Air Force jumped onto that explanation. But you get down to it, and you've got police officers involved. You've got multiple witnesses. You've got not just the guy seeing it and becoming frightened. You've got a police officer who before the guy showed up at the police station, he'd found a woman sitting in her car at an overpass, was very upset and said that this flying saucer had been following her. And he got her calmed down and sent her on her way. And then he gets to the police station, and here this guy comes in, and he's upset and talking about flying saucers again. So they go out to the area where he'd seen the flying saucer, and they see it in the distance. Another police officer shows up, and he sees it as well. It's a big glowing mass near this over this house and by these high tension lines. And that became the explanation for the Air Force, the high tension lines. But it was a series of sightings by a number of people over a period of time that was quite complex. I talked to a physicist, and it was on a different case about this ionization of the atmosphere. I think after Klass made that explanation, I think he revealed the explanation in Aviation Week and Space Technology, which was a magazine he was a senior editor for, senior aviation editor for. Talked about that, and he put that explanation out there, and the atmospheric physicists and the physicists just came down heavily on him, saying, that ain't going to be the way. But I called a physicist about that, and was talking to him about the object that was seen over Minot, South Dakota, by Minot Air Force Base. And the idea, again, the Air Force said it was ionization of the atmosphere. And I talked to him about that, and he said, well, don't you think that if that was true, we'd be seeing those all over the place? And what became clear, there is ionization does take place in the atmosphere, but the problem is it doesn't glow unless it's acted on by some other mechanism. So you might have this ionization that might affect radar in the way a temperature inversion would affect radar, but people aren't going to be able to see it. It doesn't naturally glow. And so the Air Force explanation that these guys are seeing this glowing ionization of the atmosphere just doesn't work, because they just don't normally glow. And but that was kind of the Air Force explanation for the whole case. But I was able to take it beyond that and find additional witnesses. I think it's John Fuller's book, Incident at Exeter, I think it was, does a real nice job of laying some of the evidence out in greater detail than I do in this book. But I've got the basics down there and the explanations. And as I say, mine is based on the Air Force file and then the later information that people like John Fuller was able to find. Jerry Clark has done a wonderful job of explaining that in his UFO encyclopedia, and there's a lot of other information out there in various sources that you can draw upon to. I just kind of collected all of that information and consolidated it into the book.
Right. I haven't heard much from Jerry Clark in a while. I know he hasn't written a book in a long time, but he was really good. He did some really good work.
Well, his if you're going to be a UFO researcher, you absolutely have to have the UFO encyclopedia that he did. The problem is it's really pricey. It's like a couple of $100.
Wow.
And
yeah, but
it's just so comprehensive, and I'm astonished at some of the stuff that isn't in there. but in the third edition that he just completed a couple of years ago, he said because of the constraints placed on him by the publisher, he had to leave some stuff out that he wanted to get in there. So, but it's a wonderful research tool for anybody who's doing UFO research. You've got to have a copy of that book, or those books. It's 2 volumes. You've got to have that. Because that's a good basis to start. And like I said, I borrowed from him the idea in the Best of Project Blue book. At the end of each chapter, I put a list of the sources.
Yes.
And that I borrowed that idea from him because in his UFO encyclopedia, after you get done with reading the article, there's a long list of sources. Well, sometimes it's a very short list because there's not a lot of sources, but a very detailed list of sources. And then there's a massive bibliography at the end with all of that stuff in it as well. But it's just an absolute must-have research tool for anybody doing UFO research.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's a multi-talented guy too. I think he writes music or something like that. I wanted to also
had songs published.
Oh, really? Wow. Amazing.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah. We are opening the lines right now for calls, and if you're over at KGRA Radio, and write this down, that's 855-472-5483. It's up on the screen if you're on YouTube. And we are taking calls, and Race will be standing by to screen your call. So let's see. We have you have a lot of different ones that you have looked into. And I know that the McMinnville one, you don't have that one in here. But there's question about that photograph too, and I always, I hear these things through different people, and I just wanted to get your quick opinion on that.
The problem we have is and I really don't want to say skeptical community because it's really not skeptics, it's debunkers who believe there is absolutely no alien visitation. Yeah. Ergo, anything that suggests otherwise must be a hoax. So you've got the pictures at McMinnville, which have to be a hoax because there's no other explanation for it. I thought I had done in a different book. I thought I had done a fairly neutral job of recounting this stuff. And one guy pointed out to me that it turned out to be very negative. I didn't think it was negative at all. But yeah, there's the idea that it's a hoax. But I just can't see these people in McMinnville, Oregon, the farmer and his wife, creating this hoax.
Right.
They just didn't seem sophisticated enough to do that sort of thing. Let's make a UFO site. Let's make a UFO hoax. Now, if we were in 2020 and this came up, I'd say, yeah, it's very possible because of what we can do. But this is 1950.
Yeah.
And people don't understand how to make double exposures or how to create images on the film that aren't really in the sky around them and that sort of thing. And so I just can't see that a farmer and his wife would have come up with this explanation. And then once they got the photographs back and saw that they turned out really, really well, didn't immediately take them to the news media. Didn't do that. A friend of theirs happened to see the prints in the house and said they should take it to the newspaper, which they eventually did. I mean, it wasn't like, well, we've got this great hoax story. Now let's take it to the newspaper because we know the photographs turned out. I just don't like the hoax explanation appended to everything. There may be another explanation for it, but there seems to be stuff in there that in the story that they tell and the way it was told. One of the reasons they said it was a hoax, I believe, is they were looking at the shadows on the garage, under the eaves of the garage, and they said the photos were not taken close together. They were taken 20 or 30 minutes apart, and they weren't taken in the order.
Oh, because of the sun, something.
Yeah, the sun and the shadows under that, and it's all that kind of detail.
Yeah. Oh, we got someone on line one. I believe it's the Paul. Is it Paul Hynek?
Yeah, hi Martin, how are you?
Hey, Paul. Great to hear you. How are you?
Likewise, Dave Altman told me about the show.
Oh, excellent. Well, I have to tell you, Paul, I had so much fun with you out in Phoenix back in September. Love your sense of humor. You're a lot of fun to hang around with. So I'm really, by the way, for the listener, this is Paul Hynek, and the son of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who is on the line right now. I saw you in the chat room earlier. I was pretty excited about that. Thanks for joining in.
Happy to be here, and hello, Kevin.
Hi, Paul. I was waiting for a chance to jump in. Haven't chatted with you for a long time.
Yeah, since your show.
Yes. Well, let me ask you a question since you're here. And I understand the constraints you might be under, but what do you think of the new season going so far off the rails? How's that for a loaded question?
Yeah, so I've never heard UFOs being considered to be on the rails, so I think it's going great.
Okay. Hey, Paul, did you have a question for Kevin? Or are you just calling in to say hi?
Yeah, I respect both of you guys greatly. I wanted to say hello.
Well, it's always great to hear from you, and I'm trying to remember what you said when you were out. You said that your dad had the Van Allen belt. Was that what it was?
No, I own a Van Allen belt.
That's right. It was actually Van Allen's belt.
Well, so people understand what's going on here. I actually studied astronomy. Actually, I took a couple of courses in astronomy at the University of Iowa, and James Van Allen was the chairman of the Department of Physics and Astronomy. So we had him in a couple of classes talking to us, and he made it clear to us that at the University of Iowa there are no Van Allen belts except the ones that hold up his pants. He's talking about the radiation belts around the Earth. So at the University of Iowa, the radiation belts, the Van Allen belts hold up his pants.
So Paul, you're at work, but and do you do a lot of, since we have you on the line, you actually do quite a bit of consulting for the TV series, right?
Yes, that's right. And have had an influence over how, especially my father, is portrayed.
Yeah, and so far so good. You're okay with. I know you. I do remember our conversation in last September. You mentioned something along the lines where there was one thing you weren't comfortable with, and they actually changed it for you, right?
Yes, they did. It was in episode 6 of this season, and it was the one time where I felt that, in Kevin's words, things went off the rails from a personal point of view, and they were very sensitive to that, and they did make the changes.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, great to hear from you, Paul, as always, and I'd love to get you back on the show someday again. It was a lot of fun, and last time you were actually on the show, you were on with Calvin Parker, both of you together. That was a lot of fun.
That's right, my good friend Calvin. Hi,
Yeah.
well, I want to say hi, and thank you very much. Take care.
All right, you too. You take care. Thanks for calling in. All right, everyone, the lines are open once again, and that number is 855-472-5483. Kevin, I know, again, it's not in your book that just came out, but we have Palmer sent us a question because of your military helicopter experience, wanted to know what your opinion was on the Coyne case. And I don't know if you, and I guess you have done a lot of research into this at one time, but for the person that's new to UFOs in general, can you explain? We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but what went on and what your thoughts are about what went on.
We had a helicopter crew flying a Huey helicopter near Mansfield, Ohio, and encountered a UFO. Bright green object, had, I think, red lights on one end of it, that sort of thing. And as they watched it come down past the aircraft, circle around behind it, and come in from the other side. And that's important to realize that the object actually changed its direction a number of times. And at one point, they thought they were going to collide with this object, and it seemed to lift the helicopter up physically, and so that I guess they were. Excuse me, I'm trying to replay the scenario in my mind here. What happened was the object was coming close to them, and they thought they were going to collide. Coyne put the collective, which is the control that controls altitude, to the full down position because he wanted to avoid it. And the object seemed to lift them up, and he was trying to stop the climb so they wouldn't hit the object, and he had the collective down to the collective in the full down position, and they continued to climb up. Eventually there was some kind of a bump, and the object left, and he regained control of the aircraft. Now, one of the things that I know that from my experience as a helicopter pilot, Philip Klass said, well, maybe Jesse, who was the other pilot, put the collective down because he knew what was or pulled up on the collective, accidentally pulled up on the collective because he knew they were getting close to the ground. And that was why they were in this climb, even though Coyne thought the collective was pulled down, Jesse had pulled it up, and that was why they were in the climb. And I said, no, that would never happen because Coyne and Jesse had the same training I did. I think Coyne, he probably went through as a commissioned officer, but about the same time that I went through flight school, helicopter flight school. And the one thing you were taught religiously is you've got the controls in your hands. If the other pilot needs to take the controls, he'll say, I've got it. You feel him on the controls, you release and say, you've got it. You don't make a control change without telling the other pilot what you're doing. Otherwise, you end up with the pilots fighting each other for control of the aircraft. So Jesse would have never pulled up on the collective to stop the descent that he thought they were in, had he not said something to it. I had an experience like somewhat similar in Vietnam, where I was flying the aircraft. I guess the co-pilot was flying the aircraft, and he put it into a sudden bank and a dive. And I started to reach for the controls. I said, what's the problem? He said he thought we were about to hit something. But I wasn't going to take the controls from him and jerk him away from that, because then you fight his controls. Had I taken control, I would have said, I've got it, and he would have released the controls. But you do that because the other pilot may see something that would affect the aircraft that you didn't see. So he's taking control to avoid some kind of an accident or some kind of a problem. So that was one thing that struck me. And I know Klass said a lot of things in his book and when he analyzed the Coyne case that I just didn't agree with. He said at one point, well, I have a friend who was a helicopter pilot, and he told me this and that. And I'm thinking, yeah, was he an Army helicopter pilot? Had he gone through Army helicopter school? Was he riding in the back of the aircraft? Was he actually flying the aircraft? How many hours did this guy have? He didn't tell us anything about it. And Klass postulated the green color was based on a strip of green glass at the top of the windshield of the helicopter, but they don't have green tinted glass at the top of the aircraft. Those of you who are old enough, you remember cars used to come with this green tint on the top of windshields to kind of mitigate the sun. But there are two things in the Huey helicopter right above the pilot's heads that we called the greenhouses. They were squares of green plexiglass, but it's right above the helicopter pilot's head. It's not out the front. So that had Coyne been looking through the greenhouse to see it, he would have had his head tilted back, and the inclination would have been, when you're looking like that, is to pull back on the cyclic, which is the other control in the helicopter. I think it's a very good case. I don't think there's a good explanation for it. I think that the things that people have said about it don't understand helicopter operations. They don't understand what the training is of the military pilots, and they don't really talk to military pilots about that. I can understand you saying, well, Coyne said this, that, and the other thing, but getting the opinion of another Army helicopter pilot is going to give you a better perspective on what Coyne was thinking and what the other pilot, Jesse, was thinking as the event took place.
So do you think it was like lost in translation, the reason it's so far off from what should have really happened?
I don't think there's any loss in translation. I think the problem is you've got people with agendas writing about various cases, and not just the Coyne case, but a lot of cases, and they're injecting their bias into it. They're giving you,
yep.
They're cherry picking the information that confirms their point of view or their belief structure, and they're rejecting information that does not. And I try to look at everything with a dispassionate eye to see if we can get toward the truth. So when I read things like what Klass had written about this, I know it's just a lot of garbage, because I was trained the same way, and we were all trained that way. So I understood exactly what would have been going on in the cockpit, and Klass didn't understand what was going on in the cockpit, and that's useful information that I can bring to these kind of cases. I think somebody trained in physics could bring some very good information to other sorts of cases when we talk about that, or somebody trained in chemical analysis when we get landing traces and that sort of thing can bring their perspective to it that helps us understand what is happening.
Right. One of the cases I wanted to talk about, because again, like I mentioned before, I think it's really fascinating, is the 1952 Washington Nationals. In July 1952. Now, there is the issue that happens with those particular, I guess it was more than one day, more than one night incidents, is that people will show these pictures of UFOs over Washington, and that is a false picture because of the reflections of the lights, the street lights or something, right? Do you know the picture I'm talking about?
I know the picture you're talking about. I'm not sure it's a reflection of the streetlights, but the picture is clearly not of flying saucers or UFOs.
Yes.
The picture is hoax.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get across to the listener, because a lot of people will research that, see that picture, and think that's what they were seeing. But can you talk about what actually did happen?
Well, it kind of started with guys in the radar room at Washington National Airport, which is now Reagan National Airport, and seeing these blips on the radar screen, and they're acting not the way normal aircraft do. They sometimes are moving very slowly, sometimes it accelerates. I think one of the calculations was 7,000 miles an hour. So they're watching this. They're communicating with the air traffic control radars, and they're talking to the guys at Andrews Air Force Base. They're in their control room, their radar room. And at one point, they're seeing the same objects on 3 separate radars. So if it's a malfunction of the radars at Washington National, well, you're not going to have the same malfunction at the other radar facilities. And they checked the radars and did the kind of thing, the basic checks, and they could find no fault with the radars. They eventually called for air intercepts, and they launched fighter planes to come and check the area. And what they said was interesting. Both Al Chop and Dewey Fournet, who were in the radar room the second night, told me the same thing, which was that when the fighters appeared on the screens, all the UFOs disappeared, as if they were cloaking themselves or running away and hiding. And when the fighters disappeared, the blips came back. There was one point where a fighter pilot was talking about he was trying to intercept it and got surrounded by these lights. He never saw.
Whoops. I don't know what happened.
The lights.
There you are.
And they said that.
You froze for a minute. We couldn't hear you talking.
Oh, I got a connection lost. Apparently, we got it back.
Yes, we do. Luckily,
Well,
and while we're taking this little, just to let you know, we do have a caller on the line. So,
let
but
me
finish
just say
the
this
thought.
one thing.
Go ahead.
Yes. So we had the one where the fighter plane was surrounded by the lights, but there was another intercept where they actually got a radar lock on one of the targets from the aircraft. So now we got 4 separate radars involved in the sighting. So it's a very good sighting. The Air Force said it was temperature inversions. End of story. We don't need to talk about it anymore. But if you take a look at the analysis in the book, you'll see where that explanation seems to fall apart.
Yeah, I think that's a real fascinating. That whole thing is so fascinating, and the location of it and all. We have Steve calling from Oregon. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Hey guys, good show. I'm getting a little feedback, but my question is on Roswell. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. On Roswell, there seems like there's only one real question, and that is, why did the captain release the memo to the press? What's the best answer Kevin's ever gotten as to why the captain released the memo to the press?
It wasn't a captain. It was the base commander, Colonel Blanchard, who issued the press release. He did it. I have never figured out why he did that. What Walter Hott told me, and Walter Hott was the public affairs officer at the time, and he was the one that took the information from Colonel Blanchard and then walked it to the various media, that Colonel Blanchard was attempting to explain what the UFOs were, or try to tone down some of the discussion about flying saucers at the time, which basically really makes no sense. I don't know a real good reason why they would have issued the press release. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It went to the 4 media in Roswell, and maybe Blanchard didn't realize it was going to go out over the AP and the UPI wires, so it would become national news. Maybe he was just trying to calm things down in the Roswell area, didn't realize how far it would spread or how quickly it would spread. But both George Walsh and Frank Joyce at the 2 radio stations immediately put it on the wire. Walsh got it out first on his wire service because he had a connection right there in his office, and Joyce had to call the office in Albuquerque to have it sent out. But that was how it got out, is those 2 guys put it on the a wire. And maybe Blanchard didn't expect that to happen, but I don't have a good answer for that question. I really don't. I would have liked to ask Blanchard that question.
Yeah, I've brought that up a number of times. Hang on, Steve, just for a second. I've brought that up a number of times on the show. You know, why would it come out at all? They never had to say basically anything, and for them to say there was a flying saucer doesn't make any sense. I mean, if they wanted to hide it, they could have said, weather balloon in the beginning. It's baffling. Go ahead, Steve.
No, you said what I wanted to say. It just never made any sense to me.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree. Never made any sense. But we don't have a good explanation for what fell at Roswell either. We all agree something fell, but there's no good explanation for what it was. The Project Mogul explanation simply doesn't work because the leader of the project in Alamogordo at Holloman Air Force Base, Alamogordo Army Airfield at the time, wrote right in his field notes, there was no flight number 4. End of story. So Mogul is gone in that sense, and I've never found anything else to explain what the debris would be. So there we are.
Yeah, still.
Okay, guys, great show.
All right. Hey, thanks for the call, Steve. All right, so if someone wanted to call, we have about four minutes or so left, and but that's it. So it'd have to be a short call, and that number is 855-472-5483. And looks like we might get one more call. Yep, hang in. We have someone calling in right now, and I believe it's Dave. It looks like his phone number, the Dave Altman that was in the chat room. Nope, it's not. Okay, we have. So Kevin, while I'm waiting for this to be cleared, Can you tell me how someone can find your book? It's on Amazon, right?
Oh, it's on Amazon, absolutely. I'm not sure how far we're going to get distributed in the bookstores in today's environment. They may not
Yeah.
matter very much, but it is available at Amazon, Amazon.com. This The Best of Project Blue Book comes from Flying Disc Press.
That's Philip Mantle, right?
Philip Mantle's
Yep.
publishing house, and we worked on this for a couple of years, putting it together, and I've tried to put a number of documents in the book so you can see what the Air Force had to say and see where the evidence takes us. And as I said, I brought in information from beyond the end of Project Blue Book that affects the specific case we're talking about, information that the Air Force wouldn't have had at the time, and information that's been gathered long after the events.
Right. We have Brett Clark calling from Tennessee. Welcome to the show, Brett. You have a question for our guest? We only have a couple minutes left.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to thank Dr. Randall for his work, his service, and just a couple of questions. One, if anything's transpired from it was like a helicopter incident with a police chopper in Wales, I believe, back in 2016. And the other question is, what chopper has the best glide ratio? I'll let you know that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.
I have no knowledge of a helicopter incident in Wales. I may have read it. I don't remember anything about it. I'm not sure about the glide ratio. What you do is, if the engine fails, there's what's called a freewheeling clutch between the engine and the rotor head, and that disengages. So as you are falling out of the sky, the air continues to spin the rotor blades, and as you get close to the ground, you do what they call flare out. So you kind of pull back on the cyclic and you lift the nose, and then you start bringing up the collective, and that changes the pitch of the rotor blades, and it bites the air so that you begin to slow down. And if you do it right, you level the skids out at about 3 feet, and then you can cushion it on down and you land. And every helicopter has the capability of doing that. I don't know which ones would glide the best. I would imagine they all glide pretty much the same. Once the engine quits, you're pretty much falling out of the sky.
That's right. That was when I had a conversation with a helicopter pilot that I know. That was one of the questions I had. Do you fall like a rock? And he basically explained what you just did. And I don't know if you know anyone that's ever put that to a test. Do you?
Oh, I have.
You have? Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah. I had an engine failure at 2,000 feet.
Oh, my God.
And the thing that always struck me about that was the Army training was so good. I initiated the emergency procedures immediately without even thinking about them. And
Wow.
Then as I got everything set up and I realized we're going down and I made the Mayday call, I began to physically think about, I got to do this, this, and this, and I'd already done it automatically. And I put it down on a rice paddy. Didn't do any damage to the aircraft.
Wow.
Had a guy on board who was going to leave Vietnam in about 4 days, and he just wanted to go for a helicopter ride. And I said, sure, hop on board if you want to go. I was doing what we called the ash and trash mission, where we flew people and equipment around it. We had a mission every day. One aircraft was detailed to do that sort of thing if you weren't with the flight, and that was my day to do it. And the engine quit at about 2,000 feet.
Oh, my God. Well, Kevin, that's it for the show. I want to thank you so much. We had someone trying to call in just now. I'm sorry we can't take your call. But thanks so much, Kevin. And as always, it's always a great time talking to you. And you can catch your blog at say your radio voice there.
www.kevinrandall.blogspot.com, and the book is The Best of Project Blue Book. Go buy copies of it and make me rich. No, it won't work that way. Buy copies anyway.
Yeah. Get your 32 cents. All right.
Yeah.
All right, Kevin, take care. All right, everyone. So that's it for the show. Thank you so much for listening. And remember to stay safe out there. We're going to be back next week with Leslie Kane. And I do believe we're going to be talking to someone about the new series on the Skinwalker Ranch. So make sure you check that out on our blog over at Podcast UFO. And thank you for all the supporters, and thank you every single listener. Have a good night, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky.